Please welcome the Atlantic CEO, Nicholas Thompson.
Hello, thank you all. Wonderful morning over the ideas stage. Thank you for trekking over here to the innovation stage where we have some fabulous conversations today. We're going to start with something a little bit quirky. So for the last 7 years, every day I film a little video on something that's interesting to me in tech, like a conversation I had, something in the news, a paper I read, and we're going to film them live here. The only rule is I always do them in one take. I sometimes screw stuff up. Bear with me, but we're going to try it, and then we're going to get to the main programming. So imagine I'm just talking to LinkedIn. The most interesting thing in tech, there's a paper that just came out in Science Magazine about conspiracy theories and AI. And it's pretty interesting because we generally think of AI and generative AI as something that injects misinformation into the ecosystem. We think of algorithms driving us down rabbit holes where we start to believe conspiracy theories. So the researchers decided to test this proposition in a pretty interesting way. They asked lots of Americans, hey, do you believe in conspiracy theories? Gave them a survey. The people who said yes, well, then they put them into the next stage of the test, where they had 3 back and forth conversations about their conspiracy theory with GPT-4. So they would say, this is what I believe about 9/11. The AI bot would summarize what you believe about 9/11, and then they would go back and forth. The person would explain, well, this is why explosive had to be planted, and the AI system would say, well, maybe actually it could have fallen because of the planes. And it was incredibly interesting. It turned out that people's beliefs in conspiracy theories dropped substantially. And not only that, it stayed that way for multiple months. And not only that, it didn't just drop on the particular conspiracy theory that they debated with the AI bot, it dropped across conspiracy theories. So why is that? Well, AI systems are pretty good at this, right? They have lots of information, they can respond very quickly. They're infinitely patient. It is hard for us talking to our crazy uncle or our crazy cousin about what actually happened on 9/11. The AI bot doesn't care. And so what's important about this is A, it suggests the possibility that these systems could actually make democracy better. There is no question that there will be ways that people use and weaponize sophisticated generative AI to make democracy work worse, to make us not trust each other, to inject false information left and right. What I believe profoundly and deeply, and what I think is one of the most important things for the people who are working in AI, there are ways to architect these systems that can make the economy work better. They can create wealth, that can make democracy work better, and there are ways to do the opposite. And this study gives a really interesting way of doing that. That's the most interesting thing in tech. I'll see you later. All right.
Here to discuss the future of mobility, please welcome U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg with Jerusalem Demsis, a staff writer at The Atlantic.
Thank you for joining us today.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have a great crowd. I guess a bunch of transit nerds are all here.
My people.
Right? That's why we're all here to hear the Secretary speak. So I want to start off with having you help us understand what DOT does, because it's a big agency, and I think a lot of people are not aware of kind of the day-to-day work, but also just what its portfolio really includes. So if you can give us a broad overview of what the agency is trying to do.
So rather than talk through kind of trains, planes, automobiles, space, pipelines, I think the way I try to make sense of our scope is across the 3 sets of things that we do, which I think of as build, run, protect. So build is the part that's in the news the most. The Biden-Harris infrastructure package, obviously we're building $500 billion worth of things, funding projects, 60,000 projects and counting. It's everything from something like the Hudson River Tunnel, that's one of the biggest public works projects of our time, to a six-figure grant to redo a streetscape to make it safer in a rural town. So that's build. 2 is run. And the interesting thing, and probably the biggest misconception about our department, is we don't run much. We don't run the highways, right? The states do. We just regulate them and fund them. We don't run the railroads. We regulate them. The big exception to this, though, is the FAA, which is bigger than the rest of our department combined. It actually predates our department. And that, of course, very directly owns and operates our air traffic organization and other parts of our aviation system in what I believe is perhaps the most complex civilian 24/7 operation we have in the government. So build, run a little bit, more than a little bit, and then protect. And that's really the regulatory side of things that seems unsexy but is wildly important. Protecting anybody who comes into contact with any of our transportation systems, from a new FTA regulation to protect transit operators like bus drivers from being assaulted, to Title VI civil rights protections to protect a homeowner who lives in the path of a proposed highway expansion, to the railway safety regulations that we put in place to make sure you got to have at least 2 people as a general rule on a train, which, believe it or not, was not a rule until recently. Or the work we're doing to protect airline passengers from unfair and deceptive practices. Most recently this week, pleased to announce that as an upfront protection that was a condition for us approving the merger of 2 airlines, requiring not just protections against junk fees, but also, for the first time, requirements around how a rewards frequent flyer program is run to protect passengers. So anyway, that's how I think about it. Building America's transportation systems for the future, running certain parts of our transportation system, notably aviation, air traffic control, and then protecting with everything from safety requirements to consumer protection.
Well, let's start with the buildings. I think that is the, even though you told us to focus on the regulatory, I'm going to focus on the sexier part of it, which is the building. And so the infrastructure law is different than the ARRA, which was passed from the Obama administration, in that those were really trying to get shovel-ready projects done, and in order to stimulate the economy immediately. Why are we not focused on shovel-ready projects anymore?
Yeah, so one way to think of it is that building all the infrastructure in 2009 was actually a means to an end. Those projects were deserving projects, they were worth doing, but the real reason that funding went through Congress, it was building the projects in order to put money in the economy, not the other way around. And so it was vitally important for any of that to work as stimulus, which is what we called it then, the stimulus, that those projects be more or less ready to go. This time around, we're dealing with something different. Of course, it is a stimulative fiscal policy to put $1 trillion into American infrastructure, and it's one of the reasons why we've had record-breaking job growth and 800,000 manufacturing jobs and construction jobs off the charts. But the focus is less on shovel-ready projects than on shovel-worthy projects. So, of course, we're excited to have the ones that are ready to go. I mean, nothing better than to be at a ribbon cutting for something that got done. And some of them have. But out of the 60,000 plus projects we're funding, many of them are just about to enter the construction phase, or we just broke ground. And again, there's a range of types of projects. Some shovel-worthy projects, the reason they haven't been done is they're so big and complicated that there wasn't the funding or the will to do them. So almost by definition, they're going to take a while. Others, though, really can be done as quickly as one construction season. And importantly, and this is another big difference this time around, we're funding the planning. A lot of our grants are just to get a project on the drawing board so that it can eventually move to construction. Because a lot of communities, especially some of the communities that have been left out in the past, low-income communities, tribal communities, more remote communities, some of the ones that have the most need, are also less likely to have the capacity to have millions of dollars to hire consultants and engineers just to draw something up so they could send it to our department for a yes or a no on funding with a 10% chance of success, right? So we don't want them to be that on the hook for the planning, which is why we're funding that too. So it is a different environment. Yes, it's growing the economy, but the real point here is not to have an infrastructure week or an infrastructure year. It's to make sure the 2020s are an infrastructure decade such that by the time we're in the 2050s, economic security, job security, safety, climate, all of those outcomes are going better and more equitably because of the work we were doing and the intention we brought to it.
So I was in Italy recently, and this is a country that is less wealthy than the United States. It has fewer, a highly educated workforce, and yet I could take a train anywhere. And every once in a while, a map will circulate Twitter, which is like, oh my gosh, like this high-speed rail dream utopia, and everyone kind of goes, we know that's not going to happen. Or even just regular trains, like why can't we have access to that between major American cities easily? And one of the big reasons for this, of course, is that the cost of building transit in the United States is much higher than it is in other countries. And I'm wondering why you think that is.
This is the question, right? It's the why can't we have nice things question sometimes. And well, I would say it's not just the cost. Part of it is just we just plain didn't invest. And some of that was a false economy, kind of like a leaky roof, where we let a problem get worse so that it is more expensive now than it would have been to fix it when we should have fixed it. But I don't disagree that we have a real issue with why it costs more pound for pound, mile per mile to build something here than it does elsewhere. And as you pointed out, like we can say, if you're comparing what we're doing to what China's doing, you could say, okay, but we have labor standards. We don't just roll over communities. We have environmental standards. But that's less of an explainer when you're asking why the Dutch or the Italians or the Spain or Denmark can build something faster than us. So what's going on? The answer, of course, is it's complicated. You've covered this. But there are a few things that stand out. One is that we're a little out of practice at it. And it turns out for successful project management of very big things, somewhat intuitive here, one of the best things you can have done is done one recently. Like, what was the last $1 billion project you did? So the more we do, I think the better we'll get. That's one. The next one, and the one that probably gets the most political attention, is permitting, right? All of the procedure and process that goes into getting anything approved and then built. There's been a lot of introspection, I think especially on the left, over whether we've got it right with our good intentions, with all of the requirements that we've put up. This is mostly coming out of the housing sector, where it's pretty clear that it's become too difficult to build housing in the US. But it also applies to infrastructure as well. But when we really dig into that, we have to ask, does it follow from that we should have fewer steps like public participation? I think the answer is no. We shouldn't have less inclusion of the public. It is true, though, that there are ways to make that process go more smoothly and more quickly. It includes, when does the public participation happen? If it's at the 11th hour versus early in the conception of a plan, it's going to be more disruptive. So have people at the table early. Another thing is, how does that actually get integrated into a plan? And remember, these things aren't there just to take up space. The reason there's things like a requirement that our department enforces that you include the public in a plan that has a major environmental impact is because community after community got divided, or in some cases whole neighborhoods just removed or destroyed by a previous way of building things in this country that was definitely speedy, but just gutted neighborhood after neighborhood. And of course, these were generally the neighborhoods that did not have the political power or the economic power to resist or reshape the kind of projects that were coming through their neighborhoods. So those protections are there for a reason. What we've got to do, I think, is figure out how to make them compatible with building good things well and swiftly. Then there's the fact that we have a jurisdictional mishmash in this country. I said build is the first of the three things we do. But we don't actually literally build any of those 60,000 projects. Not one of them is one where we hire the contractor and do, right? There's a city or a state or an airport authority or a transit agency that's doing the actual building. And sometimes there's multiple ones. The hardest projects we're doing are where we have many states or many jurisdictions all trying to get the same thing done. Creating the kind of policy and political alignment to make that happen takes a lot of work. Then you have capacity. So, when you look at some of the most overburdened and underserved communities in the country, and there are lots of examples, low-income communities, rural communities, black communities, territories, but one that's especially glaring is tribal lands where tribal governments are expected to maintain huge numbers of lane miles of road with a tiny fraction, right, of the dollars that are available to most cities and states. And so they're not, when we're working to get them more federal grants, but when we do, if they've never had that kind of federal grant before, we can't just send them all the paperwork and say, call us when you're done. Mm-hmm. There has to be some side-by-side technical assistance. We're doing that too. We got a program called Thriving Communities, far from the most famous of the dozens of programs that were created through the infrastructure package. But what it does is it allows us to connect with communities and link them up to capacity building partners, usually a nonprofit or philanthropy, to help them do things like the engineering or the compliance so that our own red tape doesn't get in the way of them getting help from us.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to push you on this a little bit because this is my hobby horse. And one of the things that I find very difficult to watch is how this kind of sprawling network of local institutions, governments, many people who really do want to see good projects happen are unable to coordinate. And when we think about who is supposed to help them coordinate, it's supposed to be the federal government. Yep. And so what role does the federal government have then in not just giving dollars and saying, all right, as you said to me earlier, just come back in for the ribbon cutting and we'll see you there. And actually saying, are we involved in procurement? Are we involved in actually making sure the local permitting, the local land use is set before you get a single dollar from the federal government? If taxpayers across the country are giving California money to expand highways or to build high-speed rail, we should be getting a bang for our buck.
Yeah. So yes, the challenge is that the go-to instrument for doing that is yet another requirement, right? And it's the piling on of requirements that I think is often thought to be getting in the way. So I don't disagree, but I think the tension or the challenge for us is, when is it about more resources? When is it about making the process simpler? And then when is it a case where you actually can't achieve something here without trading off against one of your values there? In other words, when is it the case that you wouldn't have to soften some kind of thing you care about, like community input or other concerns, in order for this to happen more quickly? But yes, we need to work with project sponsors, and part of the culture that I'm trying to change in our building is from, I think, what has sometimes been a kind of a fire and forget approach, where up and until the moment where by law your money's about to turn into a pumpkin, we're not checking up on you that much, to saying, actually, even if the problem on its face is that you haven't gotten the paperwork into us so that we can sign the check, that's still our problem. And this is one area where I actually think political pressure is healthy, because if the projects aren't getting done, chances are people aren't going to be saying, where's the Secretary of Transportation where's the Highway Commissioner of that state? Mm-hmm. They're going to say, like, what are we doing about it, right? And I know my boss will be, right? I get this question locally, but also I can tell you, like, literally the last time I saw the president, the first thing he said was, how can we get some of these projects done more quickly? Mm-hmm. So it's definitely on our mind as an administration.
And what did you tell him?
I told him we're working on it. Things we figured out we can do, and this is getting super weedsy, but this is, I think, a safe space to be
Everyone's
nerding
trapped
out.
here with me. It's okay.
There are circumstances where we can release funding on the way to a grant agreement. So normal the way it works is, let's just imagine a hypothetical grant for illustration. So your grant gets picked. We call you. Congratulations, Mayor. Your city is getting this grant. We do the announcement. Then there's a process waiting for what's called a grant agreement. Normally that takes a year or two. And that has to happen before we can cut the check. And actually we don't literally cut the check until after you've spent the money with the reimbursement. Anyway, one of the things we're looking at is, okay, can we have the grant agreements take half as long as they used to? What would that take? Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing we're working on. And it turns out things just like really simple things like pre-populating a form can matter when we're doing industrial scale grant making. Like I said, 60,000 projects, right? Another thing though that can make a difference is saying, okay, we're going to authorize you to spend this funding. We're not going to cut the check for you, but if you're ready to float this much money to get the ball rolling before we've signed the agreement, that's okay. Mm-hmm. And there's various things that have to be met in order for that to happen. We think it's called pre-award authority. And another thing is partial obligation. We think those tools might help us get the dollars flowing and the dirt moving quicker, even while other parts of a big project are still taking shape. So we put all of this in a memo, hoping by the next time I see the president, there's some comfort in the work that we're doing. But it turns out it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to do these big things. And yes, the biggest problem was there wasn't any funding. But when you solve that problem, all the other problems, and we haven't even gotten to supply chains or workforce availability, as well as procedural stuff, red tape, all of those problems surface. But here's one of many reasons why it's so important. One way to think about it, then one thing I've challenged my team to think about. If we're talking about $1 trillion of infrastructure spending, that means if you make it 1% more efficient, that's another $10 billion worth of things that get done. Or to put it the other way, for every 1% less efficient you are than you could have been, $10 billion of value is destroyed. And that's more than the transportation budget of many entire states. There's one other thing I want to mention that public policymakers have to think about, which is which risk are you worried about more? The risk of a project going wrong or the risk of a project not happening at all? There will be more headlines when a project goes wrong. And I can tell you, even though we're working to make sure every single one of them is perfect, out of the 60,000 projects we're funding, not every one of them is going to be perfect, right? So you think about, to take an example from a different side of the government, things like Solindra, right, that made all kinds of headlines, were huge political football 10 or 15 years ago. That was out of a Department of Energy grant program that was specifically designed to deal with risky investments to try to catalyze a market. That will make way more news if we fund something and we didn't cross all the T's and dot all the I's and hold the project sponsor to go through every single hoop just to make sure everything's perfect, right? And something blows up. That's going to create more headlines than something taking a year longer than it should. Even though if it takes a year longer than it should in today's economy, just with what's going on in construction, that might mean it costs 20% more than it would have.
So you brought up this idea of trade-offs, right? When you're trying to build faster, and then there are all of these check boxes in the way. Often those check boxes, as you mentioned, are there for good reason. They're there to make sure you're not trampling over a marginalized community. They're there to make sure you're not cutting corners on environmental regulation. Some of those check boxes, though, aren't actually trade-offs, as you mentioned. Some of them are just pre-populating a form. But even some of these bigger ones, when we think about the permitting legislation that is coming in front of Congress right now, right? The argument it's making is that actually the trade-off is that people can't sue regardless of the environmental impact, that a lot of our environmental laws, they're called that, but they're being utilized by individuals and by groups for blocking projects regardless of whether or not there's a serious and genuine concern for conservation or the environment. So what do you want to see happening on permitting to make things faster? Do you support that bill, or what sorts of trade-offs do you think we need to be making to move faster in that space?
Well, there's already some legislation that's gone through that I think is helpfully creating different mileposts here. So it sets, for example, a shot clock or a goal of 1 year on the kind of mid-level and 2 years on the most complex permitting. And since doing that, we've been able to cut that process in about half on the projects we're tracking. Some of it's public transparency, just putting online tools, which we now have on what's called a permitting dashboard, so that if people are saying, how come this project isn't going anywhere? They know they can kind of see it and call somebody. I think it's really important. I'm not averse to the idea of improving the process, because I think what you're describing is true. The word environmental does a lot of work in the environmental legislation or the environmental process, not all of which is actually about the environment. More than that, it can slow down or stop projects that are manifestly good for the environment, like things we need for domestic clean energy, EV sourcing, or refining and things like that. So let me mention one other thing that we need to think about and that we're going to need to contend with. So right now, one form of public comment is in the Administrative Procedures Act. When we put out a rule, we do a notice, and then everybody gets to weigh in. And then by law, we have to read every comment everybody sent in. We don't have to agree with them, but we have to at least read them. And that process can add a lot of time to a rulemaking, and it's there for a good reason. Everybody, especially something where industry and labor have something to say, they get their chance to weigh in. Right now, some of our regulations on airlines, for example, we don't just do it by fiat. We put out the rule, and the proposed rule, and the airlines can weigh in, and passengers can weigh in, and consumer groups can weigh in. Okay. So probably the least sizzling use of artificial intelligence that keeps me up at night It's not the nanobots and the gray goo coming to eat us all, but it's the bureaucratic equivalent of that. What if you can automate comments with AI so that at the click of a button, instead of just form letters, millions of comments could be generated on every little regulation we're trying to do. And even though you can use a robot to write them, we're not allowed to use a robot to read them, which means a human federal employee has to go through them all. That could gum up the entire administrative process. Obviously, that was not contemplated when the Administrative Procedures Act and related legislation went in. So I guess what I'm saying is, if that's a problem today, I think it's about to be more of a problem. And it's one of many things, super unsexy, wildly important, that we got to get a handle on when we're coping with AI.
So you brought up workforce issues as a part of trying to get a lot of these projects built. A big part of the construction workforce in this country has historically been immigrants, folks who are migrating across the Mexican border and coming into the country in order to help build, whether it's housing, but also transit projects and a variety of things that we consider important, capital projects that we needed. What do we need to see then on immigration? Do we need to expand the types of visas that are available to bring people in to help do that? Or otherwise, given our unemployment rate is pretty good, are we going to be drawing from other industries to pull people into construction?
Well, I think most people align with a sort of commonsensical view that you want to have it be harder to unlawfully immigrate and make it simpler to lawfully immigrate. And every time since 1996 that America has tried to do something about that, it's gotten destroyed by politics. Most recently, of course, the border bill, which was not a comprehensive fix, but it was something that would have made a difference, and of course was destroyed for political reasons. But when it comes specifically to construction, first of all, let's acknowledge the role that immigration plays in the construction workforce. One haunting example of that is that all of the 6 people who lost their lives on the Francis Scott Key Bridge out there in the middle of the night, on a cold night, fixing potholes and making it possible for everybody to commute on that bridge, were all immigrants from Central America. But it goes to, I think, a broader question about the workforce, whether we're talking about immigration or whether we're talking about workforce training more generally, which is we're actually still leaving a lot of talent on the sidelines because of obstacles that shouldn't be there. And a very simple example is I've talked to workers who are working mothers who are talented and qualified in construction. But if, not just mothers, but it tends to come up more when you're talking to working moms. A lot of places to beat the heat, I mean, think about DC, right? In the summer construction season, you get ahead of the heat by having a very early shift, like 4 or 5 in the morning is when it starts. And what are you supposed to do with your kids? So it turns out that you can use federal formula highway dollars for workforce. And if your state is willing, this is one thing Josh Shapiro, for example, has done very effectively through an executive order in Pennsylvania. I went with the First Lady to Pittsburgh. They're doing a $1 billion airport terminal. There's a child care at the construction site, which means there's a lot of people who can get those good paying jobs who just wasn't on the table for them. But not only is that the right, that's pretty exciting, right? Not only is that the right thing to do for the workers, and especially as we're trying to get more people who have historically been underrepresented in unionized building and construction trades, and that includes workers of color and it includes women. It's also just really important getting the project done because workforce and human capital is one of the constraints on all of this. The other thing I really love about this, though, is when we get it right, and I saw this in Vancouver, Washington. I was with the representative there, Marie Glusenkamp-Perez, and she insisted that I go to this program training high school age students for futures in the trades. And there was something about just how they were just like standing up taller. Like you could tell that they weren't just once they had this exposure through this program and they learned how to kind of build a mock-up of a house and do these things that would prepare them for apprenticeships. They weren't just looking at the industry differently. They were looking at themselves differently because they realized how much they could be earning. And the more we can do to cultivate that, the more we're going to have it reach more people this time around in a way that I think was a miss for American construction in past generations.
So one of the ideas that has been floated, and this gets to another one of my hobby horses, which is housing. And housing in transportation's country has not been linked at the federal level. I mean, you guys at DOT don't do a lot on housing specifically, but when you think about federal dollars going to local communities, surface transportation block grant, for instance, this has historically been used as a tool to encourage better policy at the state level. For instance, in raising the drinking age, we conditioned that national highway funding on doing that. What do you think about conditioning surface transportation block grants or other federal transit dollars on making local political actors better on housing policy, whether it's upzoning near transit stops? If you're going to give you a bunch of money to build a station, like, we need to be able to build some housing near that station. So how do you think about that as a tool?
Well, first of all, when we're promoting that, we want to, I think that's really interesting to explore. I want to make it clear, though, that we don't only have to have a cudgel to do that with. It can't just be like, do this or you won't get your money. I think because we already have so many strings attached to our money, and they're all there for good reason. But the point of these federal dollars is to help project sponsor get stuff done. It has to be the right stuff, or at least it has to be legal. But we know that, like, some project sponsors or states are probably ahead of us in their sophistication or their ambition on things like climate or how to think about housing rights. So we want to make sure, yes, we want to lift the floor. We don't want to wind up being the lowest common denominator, which is the converse risk when you have too many strings attached. All of which is to say, in addition to conditions and things that are attached to federal dollars, we're also just trying to make sure that we're funding and not just urging these kinds of things. So just this week, we released funding, far from our biggest program, but about $50 million to help with planning on things like how housing could relate to the development of infrastructure. We have a lot of loan funding available for transit-oriented development. And you mentioned international comparisons earlier. Being smart about this can unlock huge amounts of value, solve many problems at once, and sometimes help capitalize a project too. If you look at how the central train station in Berlin got done, part of it was that they understood the value of the air rights directly on top of it, and then leveraged what they were able to fund by having an office building built up there to help fund some of the other things that had to happen in the guts of the station. So especially at a time when we see this shift toward maybe a lot of square footage that was built for commercial purposes, probably better used for residential. But it's tricky to get that right because, of course, it was built that way for a reason, and the floor plates don't quite match, and sometimes the site doesn't match. But if you're adding a whole new transit station, maybe that changes the answer rate. These are exactly the things we want to help communities figure out. And through a kind of unsung part of our department called the Build America Bureau, we're using loan financing as well as grants to help connect the dots for communities that are innovating that way.
Well, I could do this for another hour, but they will kick me out. But let's all thank Secretary Buttigieg for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was great.
For a conversation produced by our underwriter, Microsoft, about the anatomy of the AI-powered organization, please welcome Jared Spataro, Corporate Vice President of AI at Work at Microsoft, with The Atlantic's Nicholas Thompson.
Greetings, Jared. Hello, everybody. Hello again. Great to be here. First, let's get cracking. So you looked at a lot of companies, studied how they're making a transition to implementing AI in their workforce and their business operations. You've been doing this for a while. What is the craziest thing you've seen?
Well, I think the thing that has caught our attention the very most is that we are starting to see the emergence of what we call AI native companies. So these are companies that are taking a step back and using AI at the core of everything that they do, rethinking their business, rethinking the industry.
These are startups or these are established companies?
Mostly they are startups. Oftentimes, though, done by people who are established in the industry. So taking kind of what they know about the sector, putting it into a new form.
So starting a company from scratch where you say, I want to sell toothpaste, I want to do whatever I want to do, but I'm going to go from the ground up and I'm going to use AI.
And that's right.
And what kinds of things does this structure work for and what does it not work for?
Well, it started, as we look at kind of across things, it started with companies that are delivering essentially services, many times information or creativity based. We have found, for instance, a creative organization that's doing interesting stuff, a law firm that's doing very interesting stuff.
Wait, a law firm that started from scratch using AI?
Yes, indeed.
Would you sign it up?
Right. Would I definitely would sign it up. They're taking a new approach to thinking.
What kind of legal work do they do?
They have started to look at the types of things that are more commodity, types of contracts that are more commodity, where they have realized, hey, going to speak with a lawyer, you could get very good, based on grounding of information, really good legal advice, but it offers all sorts of questions about regulation, questions about how they operate.
Okay, let's go into this a little bit more without, obviously you can't reveal exactly what companies you work with and all that stuff, but all right, so somebody who's established in the law, following what you said, you know what, I'm just going to do this all with AI. So they go out and they start their firm. But clearly there are a bunch of things that humans are going to have to do, right? Like argue in front of the judge, for example, and go solicit clients at cocktail parties. So tell me, what does the AI do?
Well, what they have chosen to do in this particular example is that they've said, well, wait a second, a bunch of what happens in law is counsel. You're looking for good advice, and sometimes you're looking for documentation, it might be contracts, et cetera. And based on a whole bunch of what we'd call grounding information that can be fed to the AI, they can actually use AI to do a lot of that work, to take the inputs of your situation, to process those, pattern match, and give you counsel then. And that was kind of the core idea that was come up with. And it's a great, I think, a broader example of kind of how people are using AI, not just to cut costs, but also to actually create value for customers.
Cool. Well, I have some interesting lawsuits I'm dealing with personally, so maybe you can give me their
we'll get after those
card afterwards. Where have you seen this approach fall short?
Well, I would say people are still learning the contours of AI, and AI can be what we would call usefully wrong, meaning it's just not always right, and you do have to have a human in the loop to check its work. So if you think that you're going to get a finished product from AI, then it will go wrong. If you think you're going to get a fantastic first draft, a start at what you're doing, you're going to be very surprised.
Wait, so at this law firm, right, usefully wrong isn't really a concept in the law, right? Like you're usually right or you're wrong.
I don't know. I work with a lot of lawyers.
At that law firm, how do they add human oversight to the AI input?
Well, a lot of times what people will do, just like this law firm, is they will have the AI come back with the initial counsel. They'll have maybe someone review it. They will check it again, so you actually can have AI check AI, so you can kind of look at at where it might be right and where it might be going off course. So there's a lot of things happening right now, but human oversight is really important in what people are doing with AI.
All right, give me an example of one of the companies you've worked with that is like an established company, not startup from the ground up, but that's using AI in an interesting and effective way, and then we'll go to one that's bollocksed it all.
Okay. Take a manufacturing company that does documentation, and typically what they have done is they have done documentation like we all have for years and years, decades. They bring people in, they create a project, they parcel things out, they go write it, they bring it together. One day they had this really interesting idea, wait a second, what if we came together, we had a meeting about what we were going to write, but instead of writing it, we recorded that meeting and had the AI listen, and then we said, hey, based on that discussion, we now want you to write the documentation, here are the reference documents. They were astounded at what they were able to do because it essentially meant that they totally changed the writing process from them writing to them providing direction for what should be written. It's a great example.
So they actually took away some work that probably nobody likes to do.
Exactly.
Taking in the analysis.
The drudgery, we would say, of actually doing the work once you've laid out what needs to be done.
Except one of the problems there is that one of the ways you learn and one of the ways you check your ideas is you do actually write up your notes or you do write up the documentation, and the process of writing the plan isn't just about creating the plan, it's about the process. So how does this company or any company succeed when you skip that step and just use AI?
Well, one of the things for me and for many people in writing is, like you say, actually reasoning through what you're going to write. I mean, writing is essentially kind of showing what you reason. The meeting then becomes the way that they reason together. So I still think that a very important, valuable part of the process of thinking together about what they're going to do, the humans do. And then they give the direction to actually do the writing. Now, again, this is documentation. It's not creative writing that they're doing in this case.
Right. So now let's go to an example where a company tried to do something like this and it all went to hell. What's the, of your clients and the people you work closely with and the people who pay you, who's screwed it up the worst? And you can say exactly who.
Well, I won't name names, but I'll say that anyone that takes AI and decides, oh, you know what, I'm going to take this output and I'm going to put it right in as my final deliverable. We've seen a bunch of that in the press. People go so far as copying, this was written by ChatGPT and forgetting to delete that part of what they pasted in.
Yeah, so some scientific papers that have that embedded in it, which is the funniest thing in the world. So you see that at companies as well?
We certainly do. People are saving time with it. So we see, average savings between 15 and 20 hours once people start to use it in their jobs. We see people as high as 80 hours a month that they can really save. But you don't take this thing and say, hey, it's going to do my job for me. You take it and say, it's going to be a great partner for me to be able to do the work.
Are you seeing, so one of the things at The Atlantic, we're not using AI in that many ways, and we'd never use it for the journalism, but one of the things we do is we create audio files of our stories. Like we create a bunch of stuff we didn't do before. We've created translated versions of our stories where we use AI and then we hire a human translator. So it's just adding things. Is that what you're seeing, or are you seeing people replacing things?
Both. I would say it this way. These AI native firms in many ways are a crystal ball for the way I think work will go. And we would think of it this way. You're either going to become an AI native firm or you're going to be beaten by one. And when you're AI native, you're using it both for what I call offense, so that's creating new value, just as you're saying, and you're using it for defense, which is to actually reduce costs. We see it in both cases. People are definitely saving tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, but they're creating new product in ways that they've never done before. Translation is an example where it's fantastic. You also see it doing it in places like this creative agency that's AI native. We've seen them, for instance, increase revenue per head to 3x what the industry norm is. And so you can really do interesting things.
What is the profession that is, of this, the sort of the sub-profession or the subtask that is changing the most because of AI? I would just guess off the top of my head, coders. What is it?
Coders have been the first. Coders have certainly been the first. It's the place that we see the best, what we'd call product market fit. But beyond coders, I'll actually say that managers, the managerial science is changing the most because we're learning that many managers should not only manage humans, they should manage AI as well.
Okay, explain that. So you mean like managing the bots, and when my senior bot hits on the junior bot, I have to fire the senior bot?
Well, I hope that doesn't happen, but you're exactly right. You should manage people. We think many teams, in the very near future, we're seeing this already in these AI native firms, that they consist of people and they consist of AI that's doing work.
So what are the lessons for managing your AI systems that are important and that aren't obvious?
Here's one that I never would have thought of that isn't obvious. People who do best with AI are people who have managerial experience because they understand what it looks like to break a task up, to parcel that out, to then exercise judgment over what is coming back and to say, hey, this was not usefully wrong. I need to see different input. And really working with AI as a partner as opposed to a bot or as opposed to a machine is kind of a non-intuitive, counterintuitive thing.
It's totally counterintuitive because I would have thought, somebody who's spent their whole life building up people's skills and managing people and working with people, that those skills are still valuable, but not valuable when dealing with AI. But you're saying that managing...
Even more valuable, even more. The people who do best are the people who delegate to AI by giving context, the people who don't expect it to come back like a search engine but say, good try, you went down the wrong path, let me redirect you. It is the skills that you see as you interact with, as you delegate, as you manage people. And that was something I did not expect.
All right, so a lot of people in this audience run companies, manage teams. What advice do you give them about using AI? Presumably maybe start with lots of experimentation. What else?
I would say it this way. In business circles today, if you're out there doing this, the phrase you hear the most is, we're working on the business case for AI. I love business cases. You should do that. I think you don't just need business cases, though. I think you need vision. You need to understand this isn't an incremental improvement on what's happening. This is literally a step function change. And you need some vision for how you can change your business, both to play offense, to produce the value, and to play defense, to actually cut costs.
And then, AI keeps evolving, right? We just had 4.0 released by OpenAI, reasoning agent, really different answers. How do you possibly prepare to integrate AI into your organization when a year from now it's going to be completely different?
You do need to spend some time and recognize that, again, if you don't embrace AI, if you don't become what we would think of as AI native, you will be beaten by a firm that does. I mean, that I'm convinced of as we've gone out and studied.
So who's going to beat Microsoft?
Well, we're trying to make sure it's Microsoft ourselves. You can disrupt yourself if you want to. You certainly can be disruptive.
So one of the
yourself.
challenges that you have at a giant organization with several million employees is to, or however many you have, 800,000? You have a lot of employees. Is shift everybody to an AI native viewpoint?
We do. We think we can increase capacity, in a way that is different than a per head increase in capacity using that quantum, using AI. We think everybody should get a partner that can help them do more.
What about guardrails? So, all right, cool. I sell toothpaste. I've decided to make my toothpaste company AI native. What are the particular guardrails that I should put up so that we don't mess things up? Like, give me a set of rules and principles that I should follow as I convince all my toothpaste employees to go AI native.
Well, at first you definitely want to start small. You want to make sure you understand kind of, in many ways, kind of a pilot to get things done. You want to make sure that there's human oversight. And you want to make sure that as you provide this human oversight that you're able to provide corrections in the process. Again, the people who are getting this wrong are the people who say, oh, AI is going to give me my final output. Today, we're not ready for that. It does help move the ball down the field, though, for sure.
All right, amazing. One final word. As you leave, you're going to get a little note card with a QR code from Microsoft. You can scan it, answer. It'll be a little survey. It will be extremely helpful for us. Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jared.
Thank you.
That's great.
Here to discuss AI and the future of work, please welcome Ethan Mollick, professor and co-director of the Generative AI Lab at Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, with Ross Anderson, staff writer at The Atlantic.
All right. Ethan, great to have you here with us. I have to say, for people like me who professionally pay attention to AI, your Twitter feed, your Substack, your book have just become essential. You've been kind of a clearinghouse. I kind of want to dig into a little bit how you work later. But first, I suspect, and I'm not going to make anybody raise their hand, but that there are people in this room who potentially 2 years ago when ChatGPT first came out, gave it a little try, weren't that impressed with it, haven't looked at it since. What would you say to them has sort of changed and evolved over the last 2 years?
It's a great question. So if you're one of these people, the most important sort of informal rule in AI right now is called the scaling law. The bigger your AI model is, the more information was crammed into it, the more money was spent training it, the more electricity was spent training it, the smarter it is. So smarter, larger model, better. ChatGPT, the original version, is 100 times smaller than available. Okay. All right, I'll try. It's better. This is good. I can go into full professor lecture mode to an A point and just project if needed. Okay, yeah, thank you. Stand up, start pacing around. Okay, so where we left off. Larger models are better, right? And Bloomberg spent all this money training a specialized model about the size of the original ChatGPT on all the financial data, so to make predictions about numbers and finance. Thank you.
There we go.
All right. This is good. All right. So to make predictions based on like stock market sentiment and things like that. So Bloomberg trained this model, and they spent $10 million plus doing it. And then it worked pretty well. And then they discovered that GPT-4, even though it wasn't trained on finance, was much better at it because it was just a larger model. Yeah. So if you haven't used one of the more recent models, they're just better at everything. They're smarter, they make less mistakes, they hallucinate less. It's worth trying.
You talked about hallucination, and that's been, for me, I think these tools are really great. Oh, wow. I use them quite often in my personal workflow, I don't mind admitting. But I have been fooled by some hallucinations. I'm not going to admit any because I'm the moderator. I'm going to have you do it. Tell me a time when you've been taken in by a hallucination and how you've sort of kind of proofed against that in your work.
Excellent. And the AI is trying to make me not talk. That's why they're cutting us off. But we're not going to let it here. Okay, so hallucination, just for the people who don't know, hallucination is when the AI makes up something that's very plausible, that isn't real. It's not like a human hallucination, but it's an inherent property of AI or large language models because they don't look up information in a database. They learn the statistical pattern of human language, and they're just producing the next most likely word, like autocomplete on steroids. So the fact that they're usually right is actually kind of weird because there's no reason for them to be. So hallucinations are these plausible errors. And I've had a lot of these because I've used this system a lot and I've been taken in before. But my favorite was that I had an AI system looking at one of my papers and I had it summarize it and it gave a couple quotes. And one of the quotes I was like, this is a really good quote. I am such a good writer. And then I looked to find that quote in the article I wrote and it wasn't there. It was 100% hallucinated. So I feel pretty good about that, for a second, and then I felt much worse. So I failed my own Turing test, basically, is what I'm saying.
Well, and there's been some really dramatic examples of this. For instance, there was a lawyer who filed a brief, and the judge went to hunt down all the citations and found out that they were all hallucinations. Now, is it the case that a lawyer who wants to work these tools, if they had kind of workarounds and were very responsible, could use them to find citations, or should lawyers be kind of staying away from this altogether when it comes to actually finding case law, not like polishing up their writing or whatever it is?
So I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make in AI is sort of thinking it like Google. it doesn't work like Google, right? AI is a very different kind of tool. And if you use it enough, you start to understand what it's good or bad at. So it's not great at like looking up information about the world. Citations, quotes are really weak spots of it. But I've talked to lots of lawyers who are using it to practice their arguments against. I certainly like throw every legal document I have into it first to get a first opinion. Sometimes it finds things you wouldn't expect. So you have to kind of learn where to use it and where not to. And hallucination for like small details, I'd be nervous if I had to be accurate in a small detail. My standard is always BAH, best available human. Is the AI more or less accurate than the best human you could talk to about the problem?
How often is it?
Increasingly a lot is the answer. So I mean, and that's the other thing, by the way. When we talk about ChatGPT 3.5, on test scores and everything else, it was, so to put it one way, it got 65% on the GRE qualitative. I should qualify, 65% of the GRE graduate qualitative exam. It beat 65% of humans. Now the AIs beat 95% of humans. So they're getting better all the time at these kind of things.
You were recently part of a really big study with some colleagues for the Harvard Business Review, and you were taking a look at how these tools can help just the sort of everyday knowledge worker, white-collar office person, increase their productivity and the quality of their work. Tell us what you found.
So we did a study at BCG, Boston Consulting Group, elite consulting company, created 18 realistic business tasks, persuasion, analysis, everything you'd kind of expect to see that consultants do. In fact, it's the same questions they ask people to hire them for their job. Some people got access to GPT-4, the same plain vanilla GPT-4 that 5 billion people in the world have free access to, by the way, and some did not. If you got access to it without training, without anything else, we saw an instantaneous 40% improvement in the quality of their work, 26% faster, about 13% more work done without any training or anything else. And to put that in context, when the Industrial Revolution happened in the US in the early 1800s, the average factory that got steam power performance improved by 18 to 22% per worker. So these are really big numbers.
I want to drill down on the study a little bit, but first, talk about how we might see that additional productivity sort of trickle out into the larger productivity of the economy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So right now, a lot of this stuff is being captured by people. Like everybody's secretly using AI. When I ask people in like corporate audiences, no one raised their hand, but like we have representative surveys from the Wharton Foundation. 70% of undergrads and 70% of K-12 students are using AI in school. So anyone who is still in school here, you're definitely cheating. Everybody is. But also, like, there's a representative survey of Denmark. 65% of marketers are using this at work. 63% of coders. Like, it's pretty universal. But what's happening is the value is being captured by individuals right now. Like, they're basically short-circuiting all their work and just having AI do it, and then not telling anyone about it because they don't want to get in trouble from their companies. So part of this is about changing the nature of work to encourage these people to chime in, but also how do we restructure work around this kind of new intelligence also.
How long is that sort of secret closet AI user era going to last?
I think it's until companies realize, like every company that I talk to gives everyone a scare speech, which is like, you don't use AI or use it, but if you use it wrong, you'll be punished and fired. So what happens is, by the way, I spoke to one of the women who wrote the ChatGPT banning policy in a major bank. She used ChatGPT to write it secretly on her phone because why would she do it by hand? So what happens is people learn that, and they also realize what happens when something gets automated. You get a 30% productivity improvement, we fire 30% of our workers. So they don't want to show you they're doing it. And also, Reddit's full of people saying, everyone at work thinks I'm a wizard because I'm using AI. And so they don't tell you because they're afraid of being fired. They're afraid you'll respect their work less. They're afraid that you won't get credit for that. They're afraid you'll be asked them to do more work. So until we change the incentives, I think we're not going to see that kind of benefit happen.
So you mentioned these huge jumps in productivity, and should we understand that as being a matter of the very best performers getting like 2 and 3 times better, or is it raising the floor, the people who maybe weren't so hot at their job previously, kind of now just being sort of replacement grade? So
that's a really profound question. We have like a first run at that, which the data is really clear. We found this in the BCG study too. The first people who benefit are low performers. So you're in the bottom half of the distribution. By the way, BCG, all smart people. In case you're in the room, you're all great. But if you're in the bottom half of the distribution beforehand, you got like a 60% improvement. If you're in the top half, you got 18%. Still very large. It gets a little weirder because we were actually looking at something called retainment, which is how much of the AI's answer the consultants eventually turned in as their own answer. And it turned out that for 80% of consultants, the only way to screw up was to change any of GPT's answers by adding your own thoughts or ideas. So what's happening is it established the floor by being pretty darn good out of the box. And we're seeing this across different fields. Programming, lawyers who use this, there's no bad lawyers anymore. The first run is boosting up the bottom performers because the AI does the work. We're starting to get some data that top performers, when they learn to use this, get huge productivity gains too, but it's early days on that.
And what's the difference in how the very top producers use it?
So we don't 100% know yet, right? Like, there's a really interesting paper out of Kenya, a controlled study that shows that entrepreneurs who are already doing well, who get advice from the AI, not help doing stuff, but just advice, had an 18% improvement in profitability, which is like a huge number from just getting AI advice. Bottom performers did worse because they couldn't implement the AI's advice, right? So we start to have this interesting, my whole argument's been about humans having to interact with the AI well. So you learn your own method, and experts I see that use this figure out ways to supplement the things they're less good at and focus on the things they're better at.
You have this really neat conceptual distinction when it comes to sort of how people use the AI, which is using it as a centaur and using it as a cyborg. Can you explain that? And then also tell us which mode you prefer.
Okay, so centaur, half person, half horse, and similarly, half divided AI, and you clear a dividing line like the centaur. So I like doing analysis. I hate writing emails. You do the emails AI. I do the analysis. So that's kind of the first phase. When you start to use these systems more, you start to do more of the cyborg thing, the blended human machine. So I wrote this book, Co-Intelligence, out now, and this is my third book. Every time I agree to write a book, I am filled with regret because book writing is really hard, in general. But this was the easiest book I ever wrote, and not because a lot of AI writing is in the book that isn't identified as AI writing. Instead, it's because the AI helped me fill in those little gaps, like a cyborg, right? So I couldn't finish a sentence. It would normally I'd walk away and the day's shot, kind of, right? Instead, give me 30 versions of how to end this sentence as an inspiration. Read these academic articles, make sure I'm citing them properly. What analogies could I use to explain this? Pretend you're a naive reader. What have I missed here that might be interesting? Is there something that's confusing that I should cover? All of that stuff is that cyborg work, like throwing individual things out to the AI. Sort of like how people just Google things they want to know. This is a similar kind of thing with a wider swath of work.
When it comes to the big AI labs, and I'm thinking of Google DeepMind, I'm thinking of Anthropic, and of course OpenAI. They each have a kind of flagship model, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, of course. Which do you think is running the best right now, and why?
Okay, so everyone's got their own personal likes or dislikes, but if I was going to tell you what to do, I think you basically are going to pick between two models right now. That might change this afternoon. Apparently Google's making announcements. Everything moves quite quickly. But ChatGPT is just a generally good choice because it has a pretty good voice mode. It's a good app, and it kind of can do everything. See images, write code, run code, work with documents. Most people I know who like words and writing, maybe some of you here in the room, find Claude from Anthropic, which also has an app, to be like a more charming model that's kind of more intellectually stimulating, but they have personalities, essentially. You'll get to know the personality of the AI. My number one advice has always been just spend 10 hours using it for everything, and you'll get it. There's no instruction manual you're missing.
Has any of that changed with the new O1 model that OpenAI just released?
Okay, so O1 is this new AI model that just came out. It's completely baffling in some ways for those of us who use these systems for a lot. To understand what it does, it's worth knowing two things. One, I talked about the scaling law before. The bigger your model is, the smarter your model is. And what that's always meant is that to build the next generation of models, you need to build 10 times larger data centers, spend 10 times as much money. So it'll cost $1 billion for GPT-5, $10 billion for GPT-6, $100 billion, number scales up like that. But what O1 showed us was the second scaling law, which is the longer your model thinks, the longer it processes, the smarter it gets. So this AI model just kind of thinks for a while to solve your problems. And that makes it really weird to work with. So it's capable of doing really complex intellectual tasks, but very narrow ones. So it can do college level, physics, right? Or post-grad level physics for some kinds of problems, but not for others. And we don't fully understand it. I don't think OpenAI knows what's great or bad at. Everything is kind of released into the world. I think if you think that there's people who actually know what these models do very deeply, they don't. They're using it for coding. They have never used it in your subfield. They've never used it for writing, never used it for economics, never used it for physics. That's they're leaving it for the world to discover what they do or not.
Stepping away from these kind of globally famous models, Claude and ChatGPT, tell us about some of one of the reasons that I love your Twitter feed is that someone will release a very small tool that maybe 100 people in the world are using, and you will do that 10 hours kind of immediately and tell us whether we should use it or not. So give me a sense for the small tools, the tools that people may not have heard of that are out there and that you find really enhance your productivity.
So productivity, it's kind of a trade-off, right? Because like this is like fun to play with, so then I'm not as productive, so it's hard to argue. But the thing, it's actually from a big lab, Google, but it's in their labs department. If you have not tried Notebook LM, you should Google it and try it. You can put a million words of text into it, and it's capable of both. You can immediately then talk to the text, ask questions. You'll still get hallucinations, not 100% accurate, but fairly accurate. It could turn into storylines, timelines, but really cool. There's a option to turn things into podcasts that add two human voices talking to each other with interruptions. Like, it's hard to express how interesting this is, but that's a recommended kind of experience to just have, and it's free right now, so why not? And then I'm not paid by any AI lab, just to make that clear. And then I think on the other side, you probably should be trying to experiment a little bit with some of what's going on with visual stuff as well. And the two models that are kind of most interesting to look at right now are probably Ideogram, which is really good at creating text and stuff, and then Runway, which does video from command. And those are just interesting things to experiment with.
In your book, Co-Intelligence, you kind of lay out these rules for dealing with the AI, and I was intrigued to learn that one of them is treat AI like a human, because there is a community of kind of scholars and people who think about AI who say that, look, it's a mistake to anthropomorphize these things. It sort of betrays a lack of understanding of how they work. Tell me how you reconcile those two.
So the original sin of AI is anthropomorphizing something. Like, there's all of this literature, like, once we do this, we stop understanding what the machine does, and we attribute human attributes to it, which is problematic, and everybody's right about that. And computer science have anthropomorphized since the beginning. So, like, they complain about it, and then they decide to call things learning and training. Like, that ship has sailed, right? On top of that ship sailing, it's the fact that these systems, because they're trained in human language, work more like people than like machines. Simon Wilson, who is this really great coder who works with AI, who is a friend of mine, has one of these really great examples where he had Claude, which is the model I told you is really good. It's great you could take a picture of anything, it could read documents, guess people's emotions, really interesting. But he was using it to read documents on open documents of political contributions. And it was scanning all these documents in, and it had people's donations and their addresses. That's all public information. He checked back in on the results after a bit, and the AI said, I'm getting uncomfortable. Like, this was the thing with that this feels like private information, so I'm not going to do it anymore. Like, how do you deal with a machine that decides it has an ethical standard against doing your work? That is super weird. But if you treat it like a person, understand what its lines and other stuff are, you're in a very different shape. So it responds well to being a person. Also, coders have trouble using the system. If you are a word person, you're going to get a lot of joy out of using these things. If you're a good manager, you're going to figure out how to use it really well. If you're a good teacher, parents do really well, because you'll get a sense of where this thing's going. You'll be like, no. Please stop talking about this again. I've heard you talk about this 10,000 times. Let's do it this way. Or think step by step. Actually, why don't you start by thinking about this problem? And you will find you can get amazing results. That's part of why it's important to do not just one. Like, your first instincts are going to be bad. You'll talk to it like Google, do this, and then eventually you're like, oh, let's persuade you. Let's have a conversation.
Over the last 2 years, this has been really exciting watching this kind of new AI revolution unfold, but it's given me a lot of anxiety as a parent. Not because I tend to be sort of a general optimist about the future, but I find myself like kind of speechless when my kids are like, Daddy, what should I be when I grow up? Which they don't often say to me. But I've got a 15 and an 11-year-old, and I'm not really sure what this is going to mean for their professional life in the fullness of time, 5-10 years from now. Where did you, if you're pointing young people towards the future, where they're going to work, where their skills are going to still be valuable, what are you telling them?
So, I mean, I also have kids in high school, and I think about this question. I get asked this by my undergraduates and graduate students all the time. And right now, I would say, if you're really good at something, if it's in your talent zone, if you're in the top 1% and everyone's got something in that zone, you're probably going to beat the AI for at least another couple generations. We don't know how good these systems are going to get ultimately, and that's going to have a big effect on the world. But whatever you're best at, you're probably better than AI, and you'll be able to work most directly with AI. And I think that's I would double down on what you do. I think borders of jobs are going to change. The tasks you do in a job are going to change. I don't think that necessarily means entire job categories, well, some, but not. I think that people overestimate how much AI will take over all jobs all the time, everywhere, and it's going to change what we do, just like any other technological change. And I think focusing on what you love and what you're good at is probably the best bet all the time.
Ethan, thanks for being with us today. This is great.
Thanks for having me.
We want to thank Microsoft for their support of The Atlantic's journalism. When you exit, you'll receive a QR code that will take you